Howdy there, young'uns. Silvermongoose here, back again for part 2 of my Nintendo 64 Buyer's Guide / review. Now on to the games. Like I mentioned before, Nintendo 64 had carts instead of CDs, and though this did mean that Nintendo 64 games could store a lot less data, they did have quite a few benefits. The main thing was that the loading time in Nintendo 64 was much less than in other systems, which was a huge plus. Now, another benefit to using carts is anti-piracy. Now, personally, I've never seen a bootleg 64 game, but I've seen tons and tons of, burnt PlayStation 1 games. It's just a lot easier for someone to burn a CD than it is to, get a cart and try to somehow make your own 64 cart. Furthermore, you could put chips inside each cart. For example, lockout chips were constantly updated, so you had to, if you wanted to cheat or pirate or something, you had to keep upgrading your technology. That's why Game Sharks have different versions for the Nintendo 64. Now this makes a lot more sense than just putting a lockout chip inside your system and then it being outdated pretty much as soon as you release it. Now because Nintendo used cartridges, most of their games have a battery memory, much like a lot of the older games. And this does have its benefits and it does have its downsides, but it's mostly just personal preference, whether you prefer a memory card or saving each game onto a cart. Though, like I said before, there is a memory card and many games do use this as well. Now, the design is actually pretty cool, and I actually really like it, except for one thing. There's no label on the top. Now, this means that whenever you're buying a used game, you're probably going to have something written on one of them. It's not uncommon because whenever you stack them like you see, you can't tell which game you're looking at. Now onto the games themselves. There are about 300 games released for the Nintendo 64, which is a lot less than its competitors, but some of the best games ever created are on the Nintendo 64. But really, to the consumer, this wasn't enough to get people to go out and buy a 64 because their games were more expensive, and there were a lot less of them. Now, Rare and Nintendo together pretty much carried the Nintendo 64. They pumped out dozens and dozens of classics for this thing. Now there are a large variety of games that I would recommend to anyone getting a 64, and I'll show you. One of the must-haves is GoldenEye 007, which was really one of the most popular first-person shooters ever created, and if you've ever played it, you know why. It's tons of great fun. It was really ahead of its time. Star Fox 64 is another great one. Mega Man 64, which a lot of people don't like, but I would really check it out if I were you. Diddy Kong Racing. Donkey Kong 64, personally, I did not enjoy it, but a lot of people did. Yoshi's Story, it's a short game, but it's great. Pokemon Snap, it's a pretty good game, and I would recommend checking it out just because it's an interesting concept. And Pokemon Puzzle League, don't be deterred if you don't like Pokemon, because it's really just Tetris Attack with Pokemon put onto it, and it's a really great and really fun puzzle game. Conkers BFD is another classic for the Nintendo 64. One of the reasons a lot of people today buy a 64. It's a really great game with awesome multiplayer. The Mystical Ninja games, both are very different and both are very good. Banjo-Kazooie and Banjo-Tooie. I personally, again, I don't like them for personal reasons, but I know a lot of people do, and they are great games. I do acknowledge that. Mario Kart 64. Many people feel that this is the greatest Mario Kart game ever made. Of course, Super Mario 64. The only way that I can really describe this game is magical. It is an amazing game and really set a standard for 3D games whenever it was released. Wave Race 64, again, I don't really like this game, but I know a lot of people do, so I am going to point it out to you guys. Jet Force Gemini, a great shooter. Perfect Dark, which personally I prefer more than GoldenEye. But if you really liked GoldenEye or really like Perfect Dark, you should check out whatever one you haven't checked out because they are both really great games. Now, Pokemon Stadium is an interesting game to pick up. It was pretty cool for its time. I don't know how well it really holds up to people who've never played it before, But if you really like Pokemon, you should check it out and try to get the transfer pack with it because it really does change the experience. There's a lot of fun mini-games in there too. Body Harvest is a very interesting game. It's kind of like Resident Evil Outdoors mixed with Grand Theft Auto. It doesn't have the greatest graphics. It's actually pretty poor, but it's a very interesting game. Super Smash Brothers, the game that started the franchise. It's a great game. A lot of people think that it doesn't hold up well anymore, but I think it's just as fun as it was back in the day. You know, to be Mario or Link and beating up on Kirby or Donkey Kong or something. It's still a great game. Mario Tennis is another great game. And the Turok series was actually really popular on the Nintendo 64. Turok 2 specifically. Kirby and the Crystal Shards. It's a very underrated game. A lot of people were kind of turned off by the fact that it's not fully 3D. But it's really a great game. I spent hours and hours playing that, and it is fairly short, but has great replay value because it's Kirby. Mario Party, all the Mario Party games I've heard are great. I only have that one for the Nintendo 64, but it is a really great game, and it started the franchise. And because I have 2 brothers and a sister, there were 4 of us, and we just spent hours and hours playing Mario Party together. It's a really great game. Weetrix is another great puzzle game. Tetrasphere, and the new Tetris, which many people feel is the best version of Tetris which you can get. And of course, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time and The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. For me, easily the 2 best games on the Nintendo 64. A lot of people think this is the greatest game ever created. So if you are getting Nintendo 64, you have to get this if you don't have it for some other system already. And this personally is my favorite game of all time. Now of course there are games that I've played that I don't own anymore, or I rented whenever I was a kid, and those are Paper Mario, Star Wars The Battle for Naboo, Harvest Moon 64, Resident Evil 2, and Vigilante 8 are great, and if you see them you should also pick them up. Now some games that I haven't played but are highly recommended are Blast Corps, Ogre Battle 64, Pilot Wing 64, Space Station Silicon Valley, Beetle Adventure Racing, Rocket Robot on Wheels, Mario Golf, Excitebike 64, Rogue Squadron, F-Zero X, Extreme G, Road Rash 64, Snowboard Kids games, and Worms Armageddon. Now the prices. There are tons and tons of amazing games from the Nintendo 64 that are usually around $10, but you can get some a lot cheaper. For example, I got Turok 2 the other day for $1.99, and Weetrix was I think $5. So there are a lot of great games under $10, but generally it's about $10 per game. Your most expensive game will probably be Worms Armageddon, about 50 bucks. Other ones like Ogre Battle 64 or Conkers will be about 40. Harvest Moon is up there as well. And the Mario Party games are generally between $20 and $30, but most games are about $10. Now one thing worth mentioning about the controller though, is that if you are trying to get one, try to get one that isn't loose like this. Now people generally believe, I find, that the Nintendo 64 has a very poor control stick and that it wears out quickly. Generally I find this to be very untrue. Most controllers that I found have been great. It's just, if the person who owned the controller had Mario Party, it was generally worn out because people would play it like mad, twist it like that whenever there was a minigame that required you to do so. But generally I found that they're actually pretty good. The controllers will cost you probably quite a bit actually, anywhere from $15 to $20 for one of these standard controllers, especially one that works well. Now the system itself will be anywhere between $30 and $45 for the standard black one, with the expansion pack, which I highly recommend. That's online. At a pawn shop or garage sale, anywhere from $25 to $30. And ones without the expansion pack are much cheaper. I've seen them as low as 15 to 20 bucks usually, but I highly recommend the expansion pack, especially if you want to play this game right here. Now if you want to get one of the more colorful 64s, I know there's a huge variety of colors. Probably the most common non-black one is the clear green one. You will have to pay a little bit more generally, but this thing works just as well as any of those, so you might as well stick with the classic black. So there you have it, the Nintendo 64. It has some of the greatest games ever made on it, though it doesn't have a huge number of games. It has a large amount of great multiplayer games and an interesting controller, and it's not crazy expensive to buy for. So that's a Nintendo 64. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This has been Silvermongoosevideos, and remember, classic gaming never gets old.